Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to another London lecture in this year's series of London lectures on remembering and forgetting, brought to you by the Royal Institute of Philosophy. I announced this lecture with a little tinge of regret because it's the last in the series of this year's lectures. But the good news is that we'll be back again in October with another series of lectures. We really look forward to seeing you there. And I've been suppressing this fact since October last year, but 2025 is the Royal Institute of Philosophy's 100th birthday. So in the 25-26 series, we will be inviting distinguished philosophers from around the world to reflect on where their particular bit of philosophy has got to over the last 100 years and where they think it might go over the next 100. So I do hope that many of you will join us for those. More publicity on social media and on the website anon. So on to the most important thing about this evening is our speaker, Derek Matravers. He's Professor of Philosophy at the Open University. He's also a Fellow of Churchill College, Cambridge. He's known chiefly for his work on aesthetics and the philosophy of art, but he's also worked in ethics and in other areas. And one of his many books in aesthetics is Fiction and Narrative, which came out in 2017. Closer to his topic this evening is his most recent book, I think, co-written with Helen Frau, which is called Stones and Lives, The Ethics of Protecting Heritage in War. Now, Derek has another distinction, which as far as I know, he doesn't list on his Wikipedia page or on his CV. And this is that he's the only person who, when he's invited me to give a talk, has given me a bottle of wine to drink rather than a jug of water, which was a very kind thing of you to do. I have not returned the compliment. But speaking of wine, there is wine available in the sort of hallway, the stone hallway down at the end of this corridor. Those of you who've booked in, and indeed any of those of you who haven't and have brought a method of payment with you, are very welcome to join us when the lecture is over. But now, without more ado, Derek, over to you for this evening's lecture.
Thank you very much, Edward. Thank you to both you and to the Royal Institute of Philosophy for inviting me. I should just say that some of the content of this lecture comes from sort of talks with three of younger colleagues of mine, Claire Ben, Alice Halberd, and Misha Doonan. So I'd just like to acknowledge them at the start. So let me start with something uncontroversial, that we should not try to falsify the past. So during Stalin's rule of terror in the Soviet Union, photographs were doctored to remove the images of political enemies. So a documentary photograph of Stalin in a group with his one-time head of secret police, Nikolai Yevtsov, in the early 1930s becomes, by 1938, a photograph of Stalin, but without Yevtsov. Yevtsov was simply written out of history. Now, this is the core terrifying message of George Orwell's novel 1984. Once truth can be a matter not of what happened, but what people say happened, then we cannot really build anything on anything. Now, of course, the difference between the truth, what actually happened, and our access to the truth, what we are caused to believe happened, is as firm as ever. So whatever the machinations of the Soviet state, Yevtsov was standing next to Stalin when the photograph was taken. And whatever the claims of Mr. Trump's press spokesman, there were fewer people at the presidential inauguration in 2017 than there were in 2009. So I should state my claim more carefully. We should not try to distort the ways in which people access facts about the past. We should not doctor evidence, circulate false claims, or if we are biographers, historians, or journalists, we should check our facts before we put them down on paper. Now that, I take it, just is uncontroversial. But what I want to talk about this evening is the relation between that uncontroversial claim and a thought associated with one of Stalin's contemporaries, our own Winston Churchill. Namely, that history is written by the victors. And the problem is this. Churchill's remark implies that there are different versions of history, that represented by the victors and that represented by those who lost. However, if there are different versions of history, different ways of representing the same events, then history itself skews the way in which people access facts about the past. A person's beliefs about the past will depend on which version of history he or she encounters. If history inevitably skews access to the past, what becomes of the claim that we should not try to distort the ways in which people access the past? So let me say a little more about my claim that history inevitably skews access to the past. I'll use a bit of philosophical jargon and talk about states of affairs, ways things are, were, or could be. So the state of affairs of the cat sitting on the mat is that the cat is sitting on the mat. Now, a fundamental distinction, which in my experience is not sufficiently attended to, is between two ways in which we encounter states of affairs. The first is face-to-face, as you, the audience, are encountering me now. And the second is second-hand, which is how you will be encountering me if you're looking at this through a recording of the lecture. Now, here's a way of putting Churchill's point. If our engaging with states of affairs is second-hand, that is, mediated in some way, then that mediation will skew our access in some way. So I'll assume we're talking about history in the way Churchill meant, that is, written out as stories or narratives. And the question I will consider is whether the fact that narratives skew our access means that they are, in one or other way, distorting. If they do, it follows that history, being in narrative form, inevitably distorts. Note, I'm not asking whether people can use narrative to intentionally mislead us. The answer to that question, as we've seen in the Stalin example, is obviously yes. All narrative stacks the deck. It can't help it. Hence, the question is not, shall we tell the unvarnished truth or shall we stack the deck? Rather, the question is, given that we have to stack the deck, how should we stack it? So I was too quick in the opening of this talk to say we're always faced with the choice between telling the truth or lying. Faced with that choice, the right thing to do would be to tell the truth. But with narrative, the unvarnished truth is off the table. Our choice is between one version of the truth and another version of the truth. So we can divide the source of narrative's potential to distort into two sorts. And the first is to do with narrative's construction, and the second is to do with its content. So to investigate the first of these, I'll introduce some more terminology. I shall call an episode of reasonable duration that has a certain unity to it an event. I shall call the individual episodes of shorter duration that make up an event incidents. So, for example, if the Battle of Waterloo is an event, the incidents will include the closing of the gates at Hougoumont, the advance of the Old Guard, and the arrival of the Prussian army. It's an event, which is the Battle of Waterloo, and these incidents make up the battle. However, it will also include a visit to the privy by a French soldier, some horse being fed and watered, and a lot of other things besides. So to construct a narrative to describe an event, the narrator has to be selective. It's not only that he or she could not include every incident, otherwise the narrative would be considerably longer than the battle and a lot more boring, but there are also constraints internal to the narrative. A narrative needs to develop in a satisfying way, which is sometimes called the narrative arc, and incidents need to be selected with this in mind. Sometimes an incident will need to be omitted because it just won't fit in the story. So in other words, no narrative can give the whole truth. The account will always be partial, and the writer of the narrative chooses which part. Now, a second matter is that all narratives have beginnings, middles, and ends. It's sometimes held that this too has the potential to distort, that narrative imposes a structure on a structureless world. But I'm not really sure that's true. It seems to me that the world is structured. Events often do have beginnings, middles, and ends, which a narrative can capture. But I'll just put that point to one side because I don't need to sort it out to make my argument. So a second source of narrative's potential to distort is its content. Now here's just a definition of narrative that I've lifted from the literature by a philosopher called Peter Goldie. And Peter Goldie says, a narrative is a representation of events which is shaped, organized, and colored, presenting those events and the people involved in them from a certain perspective or perspectives, and thereby giving narrative structure, coherence, meaningfulness, and evaluative and emotional import to what is narrated. So I shall mention briefly the three ways that Goldie gives as to how a narrative perspective is attained. So firstly, coherence. A narrative of an event explains that event paradigmatically, although not exclusively, by giving a causal explanation. What salience is given to the incidents that make up a causal explanation is sensitive to the interests of the teller. They provide one reason, although not the only reason, for selecting some incidents over others. Historians influenced by Marx will stress structural and economic causes of historical events, while others will stress individual achievement. More prosaically, some might stress the driver's recklessness as the cause of the accident, while others might stress his drunkenness. Second, meaningfulness. Now, meaning can be imported into a narrative in a number of ways, including by appeal to the psychological states of the people involved. So a narrative that stresses Napoleon's hubris and lust for power will express a different perspective from one that does not. Now, third, a narrative will capture the evaluative and emotional import the event had for people by using what Bernard Williams called thick concepts, concepts that have more descriptive content than thinner evaluative concepts such as good or right. These will include, to quote Goldie's list, rude, inconsiderate, insensitive, and arrogant. Narratives that use these words to describe one of the actors in the event will present an event from a different perspective that one does not. There's all kinds of mechanisms that can construct a perspective of a narrative. But whatever the details, I hope to have convinced you that the choice in telling our non-fictional narratives is not between truth and falsity, but between different perspectives. And let us assume that those perspectives contain nothing but truths. Okay, this is important. So I'm going to assume that the narratives contain nothing but truths. They don't contain falsehoods, but they just contain different perspectives. However, if they're equally true, then why does it matter? Stalin was trying to cause false beliefs that Yezhov was never part of his inner circle. And I've assumed that those who take a perspective are not trying to do this. All the beliefs they are trying to cause are true. But why then use the term distortion? How can there be an epistemic fault, a fault to do with knowledge, in causing true beliefs? So one epistemic danger is it looks as if it violates the norms that govern conversation. So Paul Grice articulated various norms that govern conversation, and one of them was, he says, make your contribution as informative as is required for the current purposes of the exchange. So omitting some information would violate this maxim if we judge that information was required for the current purposes of the exchange. So, put in other terms, the fault would be that, although the reader was not caused to form false beliefs, they are not given the opportunity to form true beliefs, where those beliefs were something that would have served the purposes of the exchange. So Rachel Fraser, in writing about narrative testimony, has identified three other ways in which a narrative can damage us epistemically. So first, a perspective can direct our attention to some aspects of the event so that we're not offered the opportunity of considering others. Second, the fact that our attention is directed to some rather than other aspects can influence the questions we subsequently ask. Our inquisitive dispositions can take one form rather than another, leading us down one path of inquiry at the expense of others. And finally, a perspective will influence the way we interpret events. We'll judge some incidents to be more important and interesting than others. That's enough of the abstract theory. Let's take an example. So, and this quotation I'm about to read contains a racial slur. So speaking in Bombay in 1896 on the position of South Africans of Indian extraction, Mahatma Gandhi said, "Ours is one continual struggle against a degradation sought to be inflicted on us by the Europeans, who desire to degrade us to the level of a raw Kaffir, whose occupation is hunting and whose sole ambition is to collect a certain number of cattle, to buy a wife, and then pass his life in indolence and nakedness." And this was not the only time that Gandhi expressed this view. But this incident was omitted from David Attenborough's film of Gandhi's life. So doing so deprives the film's audience of the opportunity to form beliefs about Gandhi's attitude to black Africans. And this in turn structures the audience's attention, subsequent inquiries, and interpretation of his life. Now I shall come on to the question as to whether a narrative of Gandhi's life so a biography of Gandhi, should include this incident. My concern for the moment is only to pinpoint what the epistemic dangers are of omitting it. So to sum up, Churchill was right. History is written by the victors, which enables the victors to give historical narratives a certain perspective. The result is that those who engage with one version of history end up with a different epistemic take on the past than they would have done had they engaged with a different version of history. This makes a difference as to what gets remembered and what gets forgotten. So two big questions arise from this. The first is, who or what decides who gets to write the history? So according to Churchill, who decides is whoever ends up victorious. Generalizing, we might say that it's the most powerful that get to write the history, and thus we always end up with access to the past that downplays marginal or subaltern communities. And this is an important question, and some of what I say below will have a bearing on it. However, my interest is in the second and in some way prior big question. Is there a right way for narrative to be? Even if narratives are necessarily perspectival, is there such a thing as the right perspective? Now, if we start at the other end, it seems easy to say when a narrative has an inadequate perspective. As Noel Carroll has pointed out, a narrative of the outbreak of the American Revolution that failed to recount the debates over taxation just would be regarded as inadequate. Now, that said, being able to discount obviously inadequate narratives does not mean that we can identify the single right narrative from among those that remain. But does it matter? In a liberal society, surely the right thing to do is to encourage a diversity of perspectives. So to quote Mill, only through diversity of opinion is there, in the existing state of the human intellect, a chance of fair play to all sides of the truth. The fact that John Smith has produced a narrative on a certain event with a certain perspective does not preclude Jane Brown from producing a narrative on the same event from a different perspective. The fact that Carlos Baker wrote his biography of Hemingway embodying the perspective of Hemingway as hero does not preclude Kenneth Lynn from writing his biography embodying the perspective of Hemingway as psychological wreck. So human beings are complicated creatures, so it's surely good to have several perspectives available if we want to understand them. Now, this rather nice solution works, obviously, only if multiple perspectives can coexist. Now, let's consider another case that is not narrative, which raises the problem of perspective, but in which it seems that one perspective can only exist at the expense of another. And now at least you get to see some nice pictures. In 1860, William Morris, the great artist, printer, and political thinker, worked closely with the architect Philip Webb to build Red House in Bexley Heath. And Morris and his family only stayed there for 5 years, after which it was occupied by a series of other people. It was donated to the National Trust in 2003, and then immediately the Trust faced a question. The house had been changed a great deal since the time of Morris, and obviously was not decorated as it would have been in the 1860s. That's the interior of the... So the Trust needed to decide how to present the house to the public. Simplifying slightly, the rooms can only be one way. Should they be the way they were when Morris had the house, and that would mean removing all that had been put there since, or should they present it as it was when it was donated to them? The rooms cannot be presented both in the way they were when Morris had the house and not in the way they were when Morris had the house. The one presentation, the one perspective, precludes the other. This is an entirely general problem for the Trust and other heritage organisations. Anglesey Abbey, the Trust property closest to where I live, started life as a 12th century Augustinian priory and was substantially remodelled in Jacobean times. It has had a succession of owners, the last private owner being Urban Huddleston Broughton, later Baron Fairhaven. He was an American. Once again, the Trust has to choose how to present the house. In this case, they kept it roughly as Fairhaven left it. Presenting it thus obviously precludes presenting it any other way. But this problem also arises for narratives. As many have pointed out, Mill's marketplace of ideas only works if all ideas get an equal hearing, or at least enough of a hearing to be for it to be a genuine marketplace. So in practice, for some event, one narrative will dominate the public consciousness. It's not always true, but often true. And obviously, this can only be true of one narrative. So whatever the perspective taken by that narrative, that will be the perspective that fixes the public consciousness on that event. So consider again the case of Gandhi. Attenborough's film was hugely successful, commanding vast audiences and winning 8 Academy Awards. Its effect on Gandhi's reputation has, I suspect, lasted the 40 years since it was released. So whatever the perspective taken in that film is the perspective people have in general of Gandhi. So to sum up, I've argued that access to the past, because it is mediated, is inevitably perspectival, and that sometimes we have to choose between perspectives. This is the background against which we can understand some current controversies. So Attenborough's Gandhi included incidents that highlighted Gandhi's lifelong endeavour to achieve racial equality between those from the Indian subcontinent and Europeans. It omitted any incidents that revealed that Gandhi's idea of racial equality did not extend further than that. Given what I have said, it would be wrong to criticise the writers for taking a perspective. It is inevitable that they should take a perspective. There are only so many points one can make or storylines that they can consider. But the question remains, however, were the writers wrong to take the perspective that they did? So let's consider another point of controversy. So when it was founded in 1907, the National Trust was charged with, quotes, promoting the permanent preservation for the benefit of the nation of lands and tenements, including buildings of beauty or historic interest. Now, as we have seen, trust properties are presented in some way, that way ruling out other ways in which they could be presented. Now, inevitably, there are many stories that could be told inevitably, there are many stories that could be told, and in selecting one way of telling a story, the trust cannot tell others. And once again, the question is not about the trust taking a perspective, as we've seen, that is inevitable, but whether they are wrong in taking the perspectives that they do. With that, at last we arrive at our question. Is there a correct perspective? How do we decide which perspectives are right and which are wrong? Now, I shall assume that we're considering narratives that are true and perspectives that do not falsify. It's an interesting question itself. But as will become clear, there's no algorithm for choosing a perspective. We need to balance a number of considerations, and different people will balance them in different ways. So I shall consider 2 considerations which I think should play a role: importance and appropriateness. Now, by importance, I mean that a perspective should make the important features salient. So take Red House again. Now this seems a no-brainer. What is important about Red House is its link to Morris. Inasmuch as there are features that obscure that link, they should be removed to make that link salient. Okay, that's what I thought initially. But is it so obvious, however? Morris himself might have argued that to locate something firmly in the past, to kill any sign of it being a living abode, is to downgrade its importance and reduce it to a mere historical curiosity. And we can add to the mix those who think we underrate contemporary or at least modern architectural achievements in comparison to the past and think it important that such achievements are preserved. So it's not my view that we simply have a load of irreconcilable opinions here and that the place will simply go to the one with more political clout. I think there is scope for rational argument and at least the possibility of the meeting of minds. But I'll argue below that it would be unduly optimistic to think that such an agreement would be easy. Now, on the face of it, Gandhi should be an easier case to deal with. Racism and the legacy of racism is one of the most important moral issues of our time, and the moral issues are, apparently, of overriding importance. Hence, if there are incidents in Gandhi's life that bear on racism and the legacy of racism, they should be made salient. Attenborough was wrong to omit the incidents that revealed Gandhi's thinking on this issue. He chose a less important perspective over a more important perspective. Now, whatever the rights and wrongs of this particular case, I think that that is just too quick, like the Morris case. The notion of importance is incommensurable, by which I mean that in comparative judgments, is this one more important than that? It's not always, it is sometimes, but not always, neither true that one incident is more important than another, nor that they are of equal importance. So sometimes it's just not true. You say, is this one more important than that one? It's just not true that one is more important or that they're of equal importance. The judgment just can't be made. Now, one reason for this is that different kinds of quality can endow an event with importance, and there's no common unit for comparing those kinds of quality. So what incidents in the life of Julius Caesar are important? Now, Caesar was a moral nightmare. Amongst many other faults, in his Gallic wars, he practiced collective punishment amounting to genocide. Yet those are not the incidents that are foregrounded in history books. Rather, we learn about his military and his political achievements, his assassination and his political legacy. In narratives about Caesar, what is made salient are the incidents that underlie his historical importance. Analogously, we can ask of Gandhi which is more important, his achievements as an exemplar of revolutionary change through non-violence and his role in ending British imperial rule in India, or his racism. It won't do to say that we can have both. We can always have both. As we have seen, we cannot. Or to take another example, consider my college in Cambridge, Churchill College. The college is the national monument to Sir Winston. But how does it represent itself? Should it honour Churchill as the great parliamentarian, war leader and writer, and downplay Churchill as an advocate of UK exceptionalism and empire? I mean, should it be proud of the connection or not? Now, I said a moment ago that importance is not the only, so even if we think that we should make the important features salient, it's a really vexed question as to what the important features are. I said a moment ago that importance is not the only consideration in play when it comes to choosing a perspective. The other I mentioned is appropriateness. Now, it might seem odd to make this claim, because what could be more important, or as important, as importance? So I shall consider this from a slightly oblique angle. Now, there's a worry, familiar worry, that morality is too demanding. This worry is sometimes put in terms of time. If morality, by which I generally have in mind consequentialism, utilitarianism, if morality demands that we're always and everywhere maximizing the good, then when do we get the chance to visit the Athenaeum, to drink wine, or to go to the opera? Do whatever you want to do. However, we might think such considerations also apply to place. There are places, most places, where moral considerations are salient, but other places where morality can be safely downplayed. We can and should be pluralists about value. Moral value is important, but so is historical value, the value of interpersonal relations, aesthetic value, the value of self-realization, which in this hectic, stressed-out world of ours includes being able to relax, and many other things besides. For any given context, there may be facts about that context that allow, even encourage, a perspective that realizes one of these values rather than another. So Kant makes this point in the Critique of Judgment, where he criticizes those who, quotes, go on, as Rousseau would, to rebuke the vanity of the great who spend the people's wet sweat on superfluous things, which is no doubt an important consideration, when he's trying to appreciate the beauty of the Taj Mahal. That it is wrong for despots to force people to work on vanity projects is no doubt an important point. However, when gazing at the Taj Mahal, this is not what matters, even if, in the scales of value, preventing exploitation is more important than appreciating beauty. So above I said the incommensurability of judgments of importance stands in the way of a clear answer to the question of whether a particular perspective is right or wrong. To add to that, we can add a second issue that stands in the way of clarity. In which places is it appropriate for non-moral values to take precedence over moral values? If sometimes in the cinema, then surely not always. So the content of the film Gandhi locates it within the moral sphere, and it would be remiss for the filmmakers to prioritize, for example, visual sumptuousness over moral balance. But even if this leaves the question as to what balance is the right balance, at least we know the value with which we're working. The best candidates for places at which moral value can be safely downplayed, it seems to me, are art galleries, concert halls, and with some obvious exceptions, say houses with a strong link to the slave trade, national trust properties. Other values can be foregrounded: historical value, aesthetic value, the value of a nice family day out, or a relaxing walk around a building admiring wallpaper. To insist that people enjoy these values only if accompanied by a moral commentary runs the risk of hectoring, to put visitors at risk of the same fate as would befall readers of Ruskin on political economy, at least according to some anonymous reviewer. That is, I just love this bit of a review, of having an experience akin to being preached to death by a mad governess. Morality is always important, but it's not always appropriate. So let me sum up. It is, we can agree, always wrong to falsify the past, to represent the past in such a manner as to cause false beliefs about it. However, our access to the past is always indirect, via representations or presentations. Representations and presentations have perspectives. The access they provide is only partial, and they can make certain things salient at the expense of other things. We can ask questions about any particular perspective as to whether it's the most appropriate perspective. And although such questions sometimes cannot be given a determinate answer, I think they can always be discussed. And I finished by suggesting 2 criteria that might govern the choice of perspective: importance and appropriateness. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek, for surprisingly a very interesting talk. You seem to accept that we have different moral value, well, different values, some moral, some aesthetic, and so forth. And in my terminology, we perhaps have to muddle through between them. But at another stage, you seem to think there's one ultimate value here, namely in the case of history, it must always tell the truth. We must always get true beliefs. I wonder why you don't think sometimes that should be forsaken for something more important.
Peter and I are old enemies. That is, okay. I suppose I do rate truth-telling. Well, I do rate truth-telling, particularly in politics and in the public sphere, highly. In the private sphere, maybe less highly. So I've got nothing against people telling white lies, and just, you know, if somebody says to you, "Do I look nice in this?" then the right answer is probably yes, regardless of what you think. But so I don't think that telling the truth is always and everywhere an overriding value. But I suppose I do hold on, and current politics encourages me to hold on to the thought that in the public sphere and in history, truth-telling is, I'm not going to say always and everywhere an overriding value, but I think a very, very weighty value. But yeah, I'll take the point that I've omitted that from my pluralism in an inexplicable and maybe slightly inconsistent manner.
Only slightly inconsistent, but surely it must be the case that on occasions a political leader might reasonably tell quite a few lies for the greater good, which will end up saving far more lives, say, 10 years later. Not that I'm defending Mr. Trump, of course.
Yes, no, so the problem of dirty hands. Yes, I think that seems to be right. Although, to be fair, I think that is, I do take your point, but I think that's as you know, philosophically quite a contentious area. I think nobody, I know at least, feels comfortable with the solutions to this problem of dirty hands. So the problem is this, is sometimes it's right for our politicians to lie to us for the sake of the greater good. And one hopes it doesn't become habit-forming or slip into self-interest. I think it'd be naive to think that doesn't happen, and it'd be naive to think that it was always unjustified. But nonetheless, I think most people feel a bit morally troubled by it. So that's a kind of not to be worked at, I think, rather than a decisive, just a case to be decisively made one side or the other. But I do take the point, yeah. Thank you.
I think I should say at this stage, thank you, Derek.
That's a pleasure, Peter.
Hello, thank you very much. That was really interesting. Sorry if I've misunderstood something here, but why can't you have so you talked about sort of the cards must necessarily be stacked in a particular way, and that you have to necessarily have a narrative when you're describing past events. But I'm not sure I understand why you can't just have a purely descriptive, factual account that doesn't have these kind of distorting effects of narrative.
Okay, it's a good question. I mean, this is something I've been thinking about a lot without getting very far. So I hope people will be able to help me. But it's and this comes out of work that I was doing on the contrast between fiction and non-fiction. And philosophers who are primarily interested in writing about fiction, so fiction is their big thing, they want to write about fiction, they tend not to think about the contrast case, non-fiction, as much as they do about fiction. And there's a fairly, there's a kind of lazy assumption, I think, about in the philosophy of fiction, that non-fiction will give us transparent access to reality. So you kind of read a work of non-fiction and you learn what happened. But I think just to give the simple example I gave in the paper, I mean, take the Battle of Waterloo. So somebody who's writing on the Battle of Waterloo, you said, well, they might just be able to give a description of the battle. That's true, but what bits do they describe? And there's a common complaint now made about history, is well, not now, it has been made for decades, that the history is the history of battles and great men and so on and so forth, and that the common soldier or the person laboring to shoe the horses and so on and so forth don't get a mention in this history. So to read the kind of 19th century histories of the Battle of Waterloo, you would get a different impression of the Battle of Waterloo than if you read a revisionist history of it now, which talked about, maybe the poor sods whose farm it was on which the battle was fought, or the Belgians who just got caught up, as Belgians often do, poor souls, in kind of huge wars between these parties. So there's a question. So there's ways of constructing a perspective of narrative which kind of blurs the transparent access we get to reality. The primary way, I think, is just in selecting what you put into the narrative. There's so much that could go into the narrative, and the bits that actually end up going into the narrative are very, very small compared to the number of things that actually went on. Does that help?
Yeah, no, thank you. Cheers.
I'm curious what you think is the responsibility of the creator or the artist or the director in that example you gave of presenting that perspective. The example of the Gandhi film, what if David Attenborough had mentioned or spoken about what he omitted, and how would that play out? And I'm thinking about why more people can do that so that we understand that it's just one perspective and not the truth.
Yeah, I didn't look up whether Attenborough had commented on this. It hasn't been a big controversy as far as I know. So and Attenborough obviously no longer with us, but and I think the writer's no longer with us either. I mean, I've got some sympathy with. I mean, I've got some sympathy with the writers and Attenborough. I think that now they would have made a slightly different film. I think that people's sense of what is important does change as we morally develop. And I think that now they would have made it. I think it would be very difficult to make a film about Gandhi now and omit some of the darker sides of his beliefs. But I suspect they would just say, like I imagine the poor National Trust people say every now and then, if somebody comes in and says, I expected to see a lot of this here, and what you've given me is this. You say, well, we can't do everything. You've got to make choices, and those are the choices we made. As I say, I think now they'd probably make different choices.
Sorry, a quick follow-up. But in general, what do you think a writer or a historian...
Oh, yeah, you said that. Responsibility.
Or responsibility, yeah, in terms of presenting their perspective.
I think it's really difficult. I mean, I think we might not be able to put our finger on exactly what is the difference between perspective and distortion. But it's not going to be a sharp line. But I think that we can have a sense of where that difference lies. and we can rightly get cross, and people do rightly get cross about people taking a perspective which you don't think is fair. But I think one's broader moral considerations come into play there. I don't think it can be pinned down decisively. But yeah, I think we just have to tune our moral antennae to know when it is that we're being manipulated.
Can you describe more about what you mean by public? And when you say that truth should be mostly revealed in public relations and policy, right? So taken from my perspective, currently we have lots of historians and lots of propaganda in what's happening now from Russia side, on Russia and in Ukraine. Where does this belong? Because this causing lots of harm. And I wonder, like, why it's not the easiest way just to say that perspective should always reflect the reality, and then you decide what you have to do with that. Same with this Mahatma Gandhi or Julius Caesar. Just tell it as it is, and you decide. Every person will decide what they want to take from this or not. Yeah, so I'm just wondering why you're basically allowing having different perspective in the places which can potentially bring lots of harm to people. And another point, I don't know how many people watch Netflix? Have you seen Healing Bell recently on Netflix? No? That was interesting. Watch, please. That was actually what I was thinking about. The girl literally made millions because she was telling people. She became a blogger in 2013 because she was telling people that she's healing from the brain tumor. Everybody knows it's impossible to heal from it, but she was convincing people that were cancerous that she actually heals by eating fresh juices. And lots of people believed her. And when they were interviewing her, she actually said same thing. I believed I was actually sick by brain tumor. And she made lots of people who, with the cancer, such a vulnerable topic, believe in her. Do you think it's exactly falls under that part? Like, it's just her perspective?
Yeah, and I agree with you that perspectives should always reflect reality. So if perspective doesn't reflect reality, then it's to that extent a faulty perspective. But the trouble is that leaves a number of things open. I'm sorry, just remind. There's a nice quip by after the First World War, when somebody said to Clemenceau, the great French Prime Minister or President, I wonder what the historians will say about this. And he said, well, I'll tell you what they won't say, which is that Belgium invaded Germany. Okay, so there's certain things that are rock, that any perspective will have to reflect. But the trouble is, then there's a lot of leeway in how that reflection is done. So you must reflect reality, yeah. But there's not only one way of reflecting reality. There's different ways of reflecting reality. Goes back to the earlier question. We need to develop a sense of when the way that a perspective is reflecting reality is distorting or manipulative, and be aware of that, and guard against it. But nonetheless, take the two biographies of Hemingway I mentioned. There's one by Carlos Baker, which is, Hemingway, the great American hero, writing out these, manly books and living a manly life, hunting and all the rest of it. And then there's a biography of by Kenneth Lynn, which sort of has Hemingway as a kind of psychological wreck, trying to get over his relationship with his mother and so on and so forth. Now, and they both, let's just assume that they both contain no falsehoods, which I think is probably quite possible. But they give you they both reflect reality, but they're two very different perspectives on that single event, namely Hemingway's life. I recommend them both.
You said morality is always important but not always appropriate, and I was just wondering if you had a way of identifying when morality is appropriate. Like, obviously, if you're making a documentary about the moral perspective of Gandhi, then morality suddenly becomes appropriate. But I was wondering if there's a way of when you should say you should consider the moral sphere here.
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's I think there's a kind of embarrassment among moral philosophers, in which I also count myself. So I'm not picky on my other colleagues. So if you're a sort of dyed-in-the-wool utilitarian, consequentialist, and you think you should always and everywhere be maximizing the good, okay, that's just not possible. You'll exhaust yourself. So then the question is, well, when do you allow yourself to stop that, and when do you continue? So let's look at a famous the Peter Singer case. So Peter Singer writes this paper called Famine, Affluence, and Morality, where he says that we should give away if we're obliged to prevent a greater harm if the cost to us is only a little harm. And it turns out, by some fairly easy set of reasoning, that we should give away much of our possessions to help those people less fortunate ourselves until we're roughly at a balance. Now, that's psychologically very difficult, and nobody really wants to accept, well, not nobody, there's some saints who do want to accept that conclusion, but many people don't. So how do they get out of that? Well, they say, oh, well, we just have to do enough to help the poor in the world, and then we're free of our obligations. And the practical thing is we pay our taxes. So we pay our taxes, that's our contribution to helping the world, and once we've paid our taxes, the rest of our money is ours to spend. And that's a fairly crass and crude way of dealing with the problem that you've just mentioned. You know, where do you draw the line where you feel you've done your moral obligations enough such that you can then just enjoy yourself without feeling oppressed by moral obligations? I don't know if anybody has a terribly good answer to that question. I mean, that's what the sort of limited, constrained consequentialist position is. It kind of sounds unsatisfactory, it sounds a bit, but it's a sort of pragmatic way of doing it. But I'll give you an example of when I was sort of thinking about this paper. I was visiting Harewood House in Yorkshire, which is the home of the Lascelles family, who did make their money from the slave trade. One of the reasons I like going around old houses, I'm particularly interested in libraries. And they've got a magnificent library there. And I was looking forward to seeing the library. We got to the library, and the library was covered with these panels, which are a mural by, I can't remember the name of the artist. And they looked rather good, and they were reminding visitors of the connection between the family and slave wealth. And you think, okay, you know, so there were two ways this room could be presented. It could be presented with those panels, and those of us who wanted to see the library were disappointed, or could be presented the library and not acknowledge the connection there with the slave trade. Which, you know, if I had an answer, so the question is, should I at that moment have had my moral head on and not felt resentful about not seeing the library? Don't know. I felt resentful about not seeing the library, but you know, it's because I just wanted to take an afternoon off morality in order to go and enjoy a library rather than look at panels. So I just don't know what the answer to that question is. It's a very difficult question.
So from what I understand, returning to the example of the Hemingway biographies, the fact that they are so contradictory and at the same time none of them is a falsified version of history derives from the fact that we cannot access history or maybe reality itself other than from perspectives, right? At the same time, from what I understood, there is supposed to be something objective in the unfolding of events, like facts that are being assessed in different ways, but are at the same time uncontroversial. So my question is, which is a very big question in philosophy, so I'm not really expecting you to give a broad answer to that. But in this context, when we get to the idea that there is some correctness in presenting these versions of reality, how do these things, how do we bring them together?
The conclusion, you could sort of, you could think of this paper as taking the following form. Here's a difficult problem. What's the answer? I don't know. And so I'm not sure how to answer that question. What is the right perspective? I mean, if you wrote a biography of Hemingway and you omitted to mention that Hemingway took his own life at the end of the biography, that would be an inadequate biography. There's certain things that have to be in there. So we can easily, I think, well, not easily, but we can tell what perspectives are inadequate. It's just once you get to the ones that are all true and they all have the basic stuff in that, as Noel Carroll said, you wouldn't be able to tell the story of the American Revolution without mentioning taxation. That would be inadequate. There's all kinds of stuff that we kind of have a sense of what needs to be in there, and it's going to be inadequate if that stuff is not in there. But then there's the extra bits where you could take this line, you could take that line, and then it's just a matter of debate, I think, as to people saying, "Oh, you didn't. I felt you kind of manipulated people there by not mentioning this." And so I say, "Well, yeah, but it wouldn't have fitted the story." And I think that's just a debate that we need to have about individual representations.
Okay, but just to finish this, then it's always debatable, or there are things that are somewhat universal that then we sense in a way that maybe is not rationalized.
I mean, Noel Carroll says that he uses the word rational in choosing perspectives, but I just can't see why the decision in the end, that reason will decide it. So let's just take the very simple question. I mean, the simple point I made in answer to the first question, which is, what incidents do we include in our narrative and what incidents do we leave out? That's not a question that reason itself is going to be able to decide. So I don't think in the end reason will sort it out.
Thank you, and thank you for the lecture. I was just thinking, do you think it's possible to both hold that no perspective can be completely truthful, and that there are some real criteria, such as importance or appropriateness, that can be imposed on any perspective? Because it seems that if no perspective can really represent the truth completely, then it can itself define things like importance and appropriateness in its own way. And then it ends up being an answer to nothing, because these things can be as vague or as relative to any perspective. But then if you talk about things like history, that is always important for things like importance, then it seems like you are saying that there is something universal and standard that every perspective should have or strive towards. Or is it my understanding that's not?
No, I mean, that good. I don't think the idea of a representation that is complete, it kind of makes sense, because I think by its very nature representations are selective and form imposing. So, but then I just like to separate things into levels. So we have so this might just be cheating and begging the question against you, but we have the representations and the narratives, and then we have a way at a different level, questions we ask at a different level about the adequacy of those representations, and we use the notions of things like, and these are very tricky notions, importance and appropriateness, as independent judges on the adequacy of the narratives. So I think you're right. If we let narratives themselves tell us what was meant by importance and appropriateness, then we would lose any bearing, and we wouldn't be able to judge narratives for their adequacy. So in some way, we've got to try and reserve these terms to judge narrative and not let them be infected by the narratives, the representations themselves.
May I ask a very quick follow-up question? But would that not be the case then, that some kind of narrative or some kind of perspective in the questions of appropriateness or importance would then still collide with the narrative of the story? So the narrative of the philosopher, if you like, that's interested in history, as opposed to aesthetics or morality, will then collide with another narrative. Sorry, this is turning out to be too long, but it's as if we're looking for truth everywhere, then we have to accept that there is some kind of objective reality, or it will always be a war of perspectives, it seems.
Yes, no, I do take the point, and that's raises, as you've sort of realised, the massive question of the status of philosophy. I am optimistically going to think that philosophy is in some way of a higher sphere and sort of not constituted by the narratives that, so if we think, this is putting it a bit crassly, but if we think about philosophy as dealing with notions of importance and appropriateness, and that not being narratively constructed, that does sort of raise the very interesting question of what exactly philosophy is, where the hell does it get its authority from, and so on and so forth. So I realize that there's big bear pits looming over here, but I'd still like to keep the two things distinct. There's not very much written, as far as I know, on importance in philosophy. There's just some really interesting few pages on the notion of importance in Bernard Williams' Ethics and Limits of Philosophy, which I recommend to anybody.
Okay, so my question is sort of related to moving this to a very pragmatic realm, in the sense that I feel in the past, though we talk about this now through the abstracts, people have typically been interested in the perspectives which they're sharing. They have sort of been embedded in the study of it and things like that. Now, what we have now through the advent of technology, specifically large language models, we have people who are sort of reviewing perspectives through a very disinterested lens, who aren't embedded in it. They have had these algorithms which have passed through unbelievable amounts of information, and through that have to develop some kind of narrative, I guess. And there's amazing sort of possibility there to be able to share a whole lot of knowledge and make it accessible to a whole lot of people. But one feels that you need to be really careful to make sure that it is an accessible and, I guess, right narrative which is produced. Do you think that there is an applicability of the framework which you've presented there to be used in this emerging technology?
Thanks. I'm not massively au fait with the debates around this. But there is. So here's the nice thought would be algorithms and large language models and AIs are going to give us something which is as close to perspective-free access to reality as possible. As I said in answer to the previous question, I'm not really sure what a transparent access to reality of a representation would be. But people who worry about this, some of my colleagues who worry about this, worry that in fact these algorithms and AI models just inherit and amplify the perspectives of the narratives that they are trained on. So at the moment, people seem, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but the people I speak to seem to think that we're heading into a pessimistic direction of actually amplifying the perspectives rather than the optimistic perspective thing of decreasing the perspectives. But I don't think that I'm not. I worry. I wouldn't like. I don't think. You obviously you can think what you like, but I don't think that the notion of aiming at a perspective-free access to reality is even a coherent ideal. So we're stuck with thinking, look, we've got stacked decks all over the place, and we're not going to get an unstacked deck, and it's just a matter of coping with, well, not coping with that, but just sort of recognizing that fact and adapting to it.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for the talk. Can you hear me all right? I just wonder if there could be some mitigation to this problem by the history writer being very clear in the writing itself of his or her perspectives and how his or her perspective does inevitably distort what is written.
That would help, I agree. I think I don't want to offend any historians in the room, but that would help, but I'm probably not the only member of the great British middle classes who listens to the back catalogue of In Our Time over breakfast. And one of this crops up occasionally because Melvyn Bragg is irritated. He gets irritated by Marxist explanations. So you get and in a way, and so these arguments flare up, which sort of are themselves slightly vexing, because one of the guests is saying, oh, it's nothing to do with individuals, it was all social forces, and the fact that this spinning jenny was invented we oughtn't to think about that, we ought to think about the social forces. And somebody else has said, Melvyn Bragg, saying, no, the invention of the spinning jenny surely makes a point. But the answer is surely that these things are not in competition, that they're compatible. If there had been no invention of the spinning jenny, something wouldn't have happened. If there had not been any social forces, something else wouldn't have happened. It may be that the social forces explain the invention of the spinning jenny, but the invention of the spinning jenny can't be left out of the story. I agree with Melvin Bragg on that. But the thing is that historians will think that they are right. So the Marxist people, the Marxist ones wanting to say, will not say, look, this is a perspective I'm taking, the perspective I'm taking is that it was social forces and so on that explain this. And the other side say, oh no, the perspective I'm taking is that it's the invention of the spinning jenny that explains this. So they see themselves. I think people who give narratives and they're picking on the salient elements of the causal explanation see themselves as being in competition with each other, not just as adopting one of several perspectives that could be adopted. And I mean, maybe that's healthy. But so I suppose I'm pessimistic about your irenic solution, that you can just say, look, this is the perspective I'm taking, you can take another perspective. It doesn't tend to work out like that. This is the perspective I'm taking, anyone else who takes another perspective is wrong. But,
thank you for proposing the two criteria of importance and appropriateness. I think they sound very sensible, but I also wonder if the emphasis on these criteria risk leaving the subjectivity of the victorious and powerful, as you mentioned, unexamined, because who decide what is important and what is appropriate? So in the end, we're going back to who get to pen history, right, in the end. And I wonder what your thoughts are with, you mentioned earlier about diversity of perspectives, like how does one create space for the coexistence of such narratives-built construction?
Yeah, that seems right to me. Even in something which seems so obvious as the Red House and the William Morris, where you just think, oh, surely it's the Morris connection that's important. I mean, I'm sure that has a system of value built into it, which might be challenged by somebody in a less dominant position. I mean, servants who lived in the house and so on and so forth. So I agree with you. The notions of importance and appropriateness must themselves be open to that kind of questioning. I suppose we live in a quite exciting time where these questions are now, very, 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 are themselves dominant in cultural heritage circles and so on and so forth. And all kinds of interesting things are being discovered as a result. But yeah, I started off actually intending to write on that question, but instead got caught up on the question of the second question. But yeah, so I didn't say very much about that question, but I just do agree with you.
It seems like your primary concern is selection, and so this idea that selection is unavoidable in narratives. And I was wondering if you can have history understood as a record of the past without this selection. My thinking here was when you mentioned George Orwell's 1984. If we could take a random sample of all of those boxes, we would have a history and a record of the past without the selection effect. And that seems like quite a far away thought of experiment, but we could imagine someone, say today, wanted to create a record of the past of London by taking random samples of CCTV. In that situation, it seems that we do have a perspective-free history. And if that's the case, do we have an obligation to try and create this sort of history, to try and preserve those random samples? I just wanted to know what you thought of that.
That's an interesting thought. I think, so I was assuming a difference between a narrative and a chronicle and a list and so on. So a narrative for me is something that's not just a list of facts or a list of appearances, but something which is molded and structured and in the ways that I was talking about, and then given a perspective. But if you just have a set of things without the selection effect, without the effects of selection, I mean, that would be something interesting. Well, actually, I don't know actually whether it would be something interesting. I suppose that's the problem. But so take a history of London. Peter, what's his name's history of London? I can't remember. Peter Ackroyd. Thank you. History of London. So that's a very it's a book. It's written in narrative form and so on and so forth. You get all the things I've been talking about. But I could imagine a museum exhibit which just had generated by an algorithm a random set of CCTV pictures taken on a particular day around London. And there probably has been such a thing. There'd be very, very different representations. It would be, I think you're right, it would be perspective-free. Would it be informative? I'm not sure. I mean, if you take for example, if you tried to write, say you were a historian trying to write the history of the Battle of Waterloo, and you just said, well, I'm going to find a way of randomly identifying some portion of the battlefield and allocate random areas to random times and just say what was happening on exactly that square. You know, it might just be, I don't know, somebody farting, followed by, you know, a horse being sick, followed by a, you know, bullet hitting a tree. You wouldn't get any sense of what the battle was or was about.
True, but then I think two things. There's one is the risk that the selection effect occurs almost by fiat, right? If you don't allow this random selection thing to be a history, it's just defined out of existence. And the second being that it could be in some way truer to the reality of most of what was going on at the Battle of Waterloo. It would be odd, and it seems like it misses lots of things we judge important, but actually it's the same as if I was trying to give a history of, say, the UK. It is a lot of people in fields not living very long, but we don't tend to write that much as history.
Yeah, it might be a nice corrective to official histories. I grant that. I just think that it's no accident that we are storytelling animals, and that stories have existed for as long as we have, and that we cope with life by telling story. I mean, so some people take this to extremes and say that our very personal identities are constituted by our autobiographical narratives, and this takes the question as to whether, you know, to what sense, what's the role of perspective in our autobiographical narrative, our own life narratives. But I think that we have narratives like we have arms and legs in a way, and that there's just. So I wouldn't say I'm defining it out of existence. I'm defining your claims out of existence. I just think that I think that narrative's just too deeply embedded in us for it not to be our primary way of representing our environment in the past. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, what do you think could be the consequences if we were to adopt a sort of moral position that was that it would be absolutely morally unacceptable to ever omit any fact, you know, when describing an event? Because it seems to me that if someone was trying to describe, you know, the truth or the reality as accurately or as much as they possibly could, without any intention of omitting anything, then it would seem to me that we couldn't, in some sense, they would be sort of blameless, or they would not at least be held accountable of trying to twist anything. And I think this point has been brought up as well, that if the goal is to, as accurately as possible, present the truth, then it does sort of seem that we are kind of assuming that there is a sort of some kind of absolute narrative that is perhaps not attainable, but is still out there, and that we still have the possibility of at least trying to reach it as much as we can. So sorry for that, but maybe too complicated. But just simply, what do you think could be the consequences if we were to hold a moral position or believe that it would be morally unacceptable to ever omit anything, if we were to hold that sort of absolute high view of truth itself?
Yeah, thank you. No, that very nicely. Sorry, it makes clearer to me what my position is. So I think so here's a view one might think. Okay, the ideal is, as you've just articulated, the ideal is to be as accurate as possible in our depiction of reality, and maybe that the way to do that is to include everything, or not give any facts, include nothing, or to do the random selections and just take it up. Yep.
Yeah, not. I mean, yeah. It may. I mean, I would think that rather than a random selection, because I think I believe that if someone were to tried to describe everything they could. I think the narrative that they are trying to describe, because I think reality itself has its own kind of narrative, if you want to call it. I think it has reality has a sort of structure in itself. So I think that might be the best strategy to avoid randomness or confusion, to instead try to describe as much as possible, or at least try to avoid to intentionally omit as much as possible.
Yeah, I just have a different idea. I just don't think that's I don't think we should think of that as the ideal. I think the ideal is to have representations that don't, what's the best word to use here? That don't manipulate. I think we're stuck with representations, and we're stuck with the fact that representations are perspectival, and that there's somebody's perspective, and that there isn't an ideal beyond that. We can't. That's just, there isn't a position beyond that, and we then cope with that by worrying about why we are being given the perspectives that we are being given, the questions of power and things like that, and questions about how different perspectives can be before they become distorting. So I just don't think that we should worry. I don't think we should regard accurate depictions of reality in a sense of trying to downplay perspectives as being an ideal, because I just think it's foolish.
Okay. Thank you.
I must give longer papers. This is exhausting.
So thank you for your lecture. If we bring another angle of some aspects that may be defining perspectives, such as genetics and genetic predisposition that may be making people more prone to some particular perspectives. Let's say if we live in a world where we have already clarified that and we have all the information and we can somehow screen or identify and link perspectives with, let's say, a genetic background that some people may have. How do you feel about that? How do you see that as a danger, as something that may have a benefit, or what are your thoughts? Thank you.
I quite like the. I think it would be nice to think that there's a gene possessed by the Russians, say, or the Irish, which makes them which gives those national stories a particular character, and you could explain. But is it in the end going to be an empirical question as to whether there is a link between genetics and sorts of perspective? If so, I would be surprised if there were such a link. I think it's, although it doesn't surprise me, it wouldn't surprise me if somebody had an AI model that somehow found similarities between the sorts of perspective one gets in certain cultures. Certain perspectives, a random two perspectives from the same culture have more in common with each other than a random two perspectives from different cultures. That wouldn't surprise me. But then the explanation to that, again, an empirical matter, would be more likely to be cultural than genetic. But I do rather like, it sounds like a good basis for a science fiction short story where you could sort of find a gene for taking perspectives.
Thank you.
I shall think on it. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go back over to this side in a second, but I'm going to ask a question first. So look, as if I understand you rightly, you're sort of saying narratives are constrained by truth, but actually there are these other norms at work, appropriateness and importance. So here's a puzzle, which is that if you've got two narratives from different perspectives, are they compatible with one another or aren't they? If they are compatible with one another, it looks as if you ought to be able to combine them into one larger narrative. So there's some story about Hemingway which makes out both that he was a heroic hunter-gatherer and a psychological wreck. And sometimes that's going to be true, in which case that sort of challenges your pluralism. It's just there are lots of narratives, but different perspectives are just, different parts of the elephant. On the other hand, we sometimes have a sense that different narratives are incompatible with one another. How do you explain incompatibility if narratives aren't actually answerable to, if perspectives rather are not answerable to truth as well as the kind of incidents and events that make them up?
I think, good question. I think how about this? I think the strongest answer to that question, I think that there's several different, maybe some other considerations that could come into play as well, is different people think different things are important. So to go back to the Hemingway case, if the two biographers meet, and I can imagine Lynn saying to Baker, but why didn't you think that Hemingway's visit to his mother in 1923 was important, given the Hemingway's writing at the time? And Baker saying, why would you think that was important? And that discussion not being resolvable. Why? Well, because what people think is important is only is not closely connected to what they think is true. So both, it might be to take a case that you might recognize. It might be that the driver was both reckless and drunk. But some people might think it's the recklessness that's the important thing to focus on, because they want a character, an explanation of the event in terms of the dispositions and character. Another person might think, no, it's the drunkenness, because they want an explanation in terms of the particular effects. And it's, what people think is important will depend on their broader beliefs and possibly their broader moral beliefs. But I don't think that stuff is reducible to differences in what they take to be true.
I mean, just one quick reply, which is that the last people whom you might expect to recognize the importance of their rival biographers' facts are the two biographers themselves. So the fact that Baker says, why do you think that was important, doesn't mean that the general reader might not think, oh, well, these two different people, two different perspectives, but I'm just going to mash them all together and get a bigger version of the truth.
Yes, and actually this sort of comes out to the answer that I gave to the gentleman over there. When I'm listening to In Our Time, I sometimes think that. I just think, why do you people think, why do you two academics think that your positions are irreconcilable? Because they're not irreconcilable. You are, the two perspectives are reconcilable. But I think, but as you so rightly say, people in the thick of the debate tend to think that they are right and the other person is wrong. I don't think that we should take that as gospel, that their view of the debate might not be the view of the debate of a dispassionate observer.
A salutary warning for philosophers who notoriously disagree.
My question is, what view do you take of if you were to go with a lens where you were to try and construct an account or a narrative of history through looking at the ideas that you might imagine, the motivations that exist in the minds of people during that time, if you like, ideology. For example, if you were to have a consideration of something like the impact of eugenics, and as an example of an ideology that might exist at a certain time, which we're aware of, and how that plays in the motivations of actors and constructions of various sorts. I mean, if you mentioned Marxism before, that there's a social and an economic perspective. But if we're getting more into the sort of psychological or motivation space of ideology, would you be sympathetic to the construction of say, a sort of an attempt to reconstruct a history through taking a strong account of one particular lens. Say if you were to go to construct a history of, for example, history of psychiatry, looking at eugenics, for example, as a means to construct a certain account, how you might view that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think there are. I think if you look at the history of history, if you like, or if you don't even have to go back very far, and you look at the different accounts of the different thoughts about what explanation is that various different historians have employed. So, if you go back to the 1970s, all the art historians are as bad, really. You go back to the 1970s, and you have Marxist historians, and you have people who are writing from a non-Marxist perspective, and you get very, very different history books on the very, very different perspectives on the same events. Now, I'm sure you're right that you could keep writing histories adopting different perspectives. So you could write a history of psychology adopting a perspective which made eugenics, that took eugenics to be the salient driver of the history of psychology. It might turn out to be interesting. I mean, given my commitment to there being no such thing as a non-perspectival history, in a way, I barring the nutters out there, I kind of welcome histories written from perspectives. I mean, I do find opinionated biographies quite interesting. I find biographies which try to be overly even-handed less interesting. So I do sort of rather like the presence of a sort of overt perspective in a representation. I guess the danger is if the author thinks that they've hit upon the truth, and every other take on this is going to be wrong. But I don't know if that answers your question. But because I'm a bit of I'm keen on perspectives, which is why I worry so much about rightness and wrongness of them.
Would you consider it just a perspective, or is it doing more work than perspective taking?
I'm not sure you can have a perspective that's not a perspective on something. But that sounded good.
If you're sort of trying to dig up the perspectives within the subjects of at that particular time, so it's not just your perspective as the historian or the.
Okay, sorry, I see what you mean. Yeah, I mean that sounds to me quite interesting. I mean, if somebody, and maybe there are histories of philosophy like this. I'm sure there might be nice histories of history like this, where the perspective is on the taking of perspectives. I'm not sure I've grasped you, but I mean that there's a lovely the biography of the guy who ended up as the historian, Hugh Dacre. Who ended up as the Hugh Trevor Roper? I recommend the biography of Hugh Trevor Roper, which is a marvelous book, just about how much historians hated each other because they were writing history from adopting different things being salient, adopting different perspectives. And a book that wrote about the debates within history for the past 20 or 30 years would be a book that I'd be happy to read, just by comparing the different perspectives that people took. So I don't see anything wrong with a perspective on perspective, if that's what you're saying, but I'm not quite sure I grasped your knowledge.
Thank you for the lecture. Some of the best art is art that just asks questions and doesn't attempt to answer any questions. I was just trying to reflect on how one keeps doubt in this world. because it's a different way of doing things. But when you do go to, like, say, they've had a rehang of the National Portrait Gallery, where they've tried to do both things, where you have different perspectives on the same label, and you see people getting annoyed or thinking it's too woke or whatever it might be. But as an artist, you're always trying to create things that still maintain the doubt all the way throughout. And I'm just trying to sort of think through what you were saying.
Thanks. That I hadn't actually thought of that. That seems to me that seems completely right. I mean, in the sense that, well, here's a broad generalization, which is going to be obviously false in many cases, but still I'll stick with it, which is that individual works of art that are too perspectival are very seldom the better for it. That's something, unlike works of narrative history. So there's a contrast between a work of art and a work of history. Work of art, tell artists what they want to do, but philosophers talk about the messages in art, which always slightly, makes art historians quite rightly shiver, because as if you can pin down the individual work of art to a particular message from a particular perspective. But I guess both artists and what you've just said about the National Portrait Gallery, curators can pose questions about perspective rather than try and enforce a perspective, if that's the contrast you're trying to draw. That seems to me very interesting. Yeah, I actually, weirdly, given that I'm a philosopher of art, I hadn't brought my thinking about art together with my thinking about perspectives, but that's a nice way of bringing them together.
Well, that's perhaps a good point at which to stop the Q&A, because we've, as well as exhausting you with questions, now given you something else to write about next time you come and give a paper.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for your participation this evening, and thank you, Derek, for the talk.
Thank you. Thank you.